It was a warm afternoon, and the sun hung lazily in the sky as Marcus drove down a quiet street in his old sit-in. He had just finished a long shift at the local restaurant, where he worked as a cook. His mind was still on the busy day, thinking about the next steps in his life. Marcus had dreams of making something more of himself, but today, like so many other days, he was just getting by. He hadn't expected anything out of the ordinary, just another drive home after work. But as he made a left turn onto a less traveled road, the sudden flash of red and blue lights in his rearview mirror caught him off guard. The sound of a siren echoed through the car as he pulled over to the side of the street. Not today, Marcus thought to himself, taking a deep breath. He had been pulled over a few times in the past for minor traffic violations, but there was always a strange feeling whenever it happened. He tried to shake off the unease, reminding himself to stay calm. He put his car in park, rolled down his window, and waited. A police officer stepped up to his window. The officer was tall, wearing dark sunglasses, and had a stern look on his face. Marcus had no idea why he'd been stopped. He wasn't speeding, his turn had been clean, and everything seemed to be in order. The officer leaned over slightly and spoke with a firm voice. "License and registration," he said. Marcus nodded, reaching for his wallet and pulling out the necessary documents. "Sure, officer. May I ask what the problem is?" The officer glanced at the documents without responding. His eyes were cold, almost indifferent. Marcus noticed a slight tension in the officer's shoulders, as if something about the situation wasn't quite right. "You were weaving in and out of lanes back there. That's dangerous driving," the officer finally said, a little too quickly. Marcus was confused. He hadn't felt the car swerve or stray out of the lanes. He knew he was fine, but he didn't argue. It was always better to stay calm and respectful during a traffic stop. He handed the officer his registration and license without saying another word. "Do you have any weapons, drugs, or anything else I should know about in the car?" The officer's tone had shifted slightly now, growing more authoritative. "No, officer," Marcus answered politely, trying to keep his voice steady. "There's nothing in my car." The officer didn't respond right away. Instead, he looked at Marcus for a long moment, as if trying to size him up. It wasn't the first time Marcus had been pulled over, but there was something in the officer's eyes that made him uneasy. The officer's posture seemed too rigid, his movements too deliberate. Without warning, the officer motioned for Marcus to get out of the car. "Step out, please," he ordered. Marcus hesitated, wondering what was happening. He had never been asked to step out of the car during a routine stop. But he complied, slowly opening the door and stepping out onto the sidewalk. The officer didn't seem interested in explaining why he was making the request. Instead, he began to circle Marcus's car, inspecting it with a strange intensity. "Stay put," the officer said, his voice stern. He didn't make eye contact, but there was something unsettling about the way he was moving around the vehicle. Marcus felt his heart rate quicken, but he remained still, waiting to see what would happen next. Marcus had no idea that this routine stop would be anything but ordinary. Little did he know, this would be the beginning of a story that would change everything for him. The officer's strange behavior, though subtle, was about to set a series of events in motion that would lead Marcus into an unexpected battle for justice, and a fight he never saw coming. Marcus stood by his car, trying to stay calm as the officer moved around it. His mind raced, trying to figure out what was happening. Why had he been asked to step out? Why was the officer so interested in his vehicle? The officer didn't seem to care about the answer to his earlier question about weapons or drugs. Instead, he continued inspecting the car, peering inside the windows and glancing over the tires as though looking for something. A feeling of unease started to settle in Marcus's stomach. He kept his hands visible at his sides, aware that any wrong move could be misinterpreted. He had been told by family and friends to always stay calm during a stop like this, to avoid giving the officer any reason to escalate the situation. But today felt different. There was something in the officer's manner that made Marcus uneasy. After what felt like forever, The officer finally returned to Marcus. He didn't smile. He didn't offer an explanation. He just stood there, staring at Marcus with an unsettling look. "I'm going to need to search your car," the officer said flatly. Marcus blinked, confused. "Search my car," he repeated. "For what?" The officer didn't answer the question. He simply gestured for Marcus to step back a little. "Just step back and wait over there," the officer said, pointing toward the sidewalk. Marcus didn't move immediately. "Is there a reason for this? Am I under arrest or something?" "No," the officer said sharply, still not explaining anything. "Just stay there and don't move." Marcus took a deep breath, realizing there was no point in arguing. He stepped back a few feet, watching as the officer pulled out a pair of gloves and began opening the car doors. The sound of the doors creaking and the officer rummaging through his belongings felt like the longest moments of Marcus's life. As the officer continued his search, Marcus's mind raced. He knew his rights, but he also knew that sometimes arguing or pushing back during a traffic stop could make things worse. He tried to remind himself to stay patient, even though he felt a knot tightening in his chest. The officer began looking through the back seat of the car, then the trunk. Marcus couldn't see what the officer was doing, but it was clear that something was wrong. The officer was being overly thorough, moving things around like he was searching for something specific. Marcus could sense that this was no ordinary search. It wasn't about finding anything illegal. It was about something else, something hidden. After a few minutes, the officer turned back to Marcus. "I found something," he said, his voice flat. He reached into the back of the car, pulling out a small bag wrapped in plastic. Marcus's heart skipped a beat. He stared at the bag, unsure of what he was seeing. The officer was holding it up in front of him, as if it was the most natural thing in the world. "This is what I thought," the officer said, his eyes narrowing. "You're carrying illegal substances." Marcus felt his blood run cold. This wasn't possible. He had no idea what was going on, but he knew one thing for sure. He hadn't put anything in his car. He hadn't even touched that bag. He had no drugs, no illegal items in his car. Before he could say anything, the officer was already speaking again. "I'm going to have to arrest you," he said, "for possession of illegal drugs." Marcus couldn't believe what he was hearing. He wanted to speak, to explain, but the words wouldn't come. He had been through this before. He knew that arguing wouldn't help. So instead, he kept quiet and tried to focus on something else. There had to be a way out of this. But how? Little did Marcus know, his next decision would turn the tables in a way that would surprise everyone, especially the officer. As the officer began writing up the report, Marcus stood there, trying to remain calm, but his mind was racing. His thoughts were a whirlwind of confusion and fear. He couldn't believe what was happening. The officer had just found illegal drugs in his car, something Marcus knew he hadn't put there. But there was nothing he could do to prove his innocence. The officer had the power, and Marcus was just one man with no idea how to defend himself. However, what the officer didn't know was that Marcus had been recording everything on his phone. The driver's side mirror reflected his phone, which was propped up on the dashboard, still recording silently. Marcus had always been careful. His job, his community, and his experiences had taught him to keep his phone recording during any interaction with the police. It was a precaution he had learned from others who had been wronged in similar situations. While the officer was busy with his paperwork, Marcus's heart beat a little faster. He knew that the recording on his phone could be the key to everything. He had no idea what the officer might do next, but if the phone's recording captured what had really happened, it would show the truth. Marcus wasn't going to let this moment slip away without a chance at justice. The officer, too focused on his work, didn't notice the phone sitting quietly, gathering the evidence Marcus would need. It seemed like the officer had no idea that the recording was continuing. Marcus's mind turned over everything he had seen. The way the officer had been so insistent on searching his car, the way the officer had planted the small plastic bag in his vehicle, and how quickly the officer had jumped to conclusions. For a moment, Marcus thought about what would happen if the officer found the phone and realized what he had been doing. Would he try to destroy the evidence? Would he escalate things further? He couldn't be sure, but he had to take the risk. The phone was his only chance. It was the only thing that could expose what had really happened. As the officer moved around his car, seemingly lost in the process of making notes and finalizing the arrest, Marcus's fingers tightened around the edge of his jacket. He knew he had to stay calm, no matter how angry or scared he felt. He couldn't afford to show any signs of panic. His best bet was to be quiet, to wait until he was either let go or the situation escalated. Minutes passed, and the officer finally walked back to Marcus, holding the paperwork in his hand. He handed Marcus a ticket, along with a summons to appear in court. "Have a seat in the back of my car while I finish up here," the officer ordered. "You're not free to leave yet." Marcus nodded without saying anything. He knew that he had to play his part carefully, following the officer's commands, even if the situation didn't feel right. He sat in the back of the patrol car, his thoughts still racing. He kept his eyes on the officer, who was now looking over the paperwork again, as if double-checking his steps. Marcus couldn't help but wonder if the officer knew he had been recording. The officer didn't act suspicious, but Marcus had learned never to underestimate the lengths people would go to hide the truth. Sitting in the back of the patrol car, Marcus felt a rush of hope. He had something the officer didn't know about, a secret recording that could change everything. The truth was right there, in his pocket, and it was waiting to be revealed. But he had to wait for the right moment, and he had to make sure that no one would interfere with what he had captured. The battle for justice had just begun. Marcus sat in the back of the police car, his mind spinning with the unexpected turn of events. His heart pounded in his chest, and his hands, though resting in his lap, felt clammy with tension. The officer had accused him of possessing illegal substances, something he knew he didn't do. He felt trapped, unsure of how to navigate the situation. But all he could do for now was wait. Outside, the officer was still finishing up his paperwork, walking back and forth beside the car, seemingly lost in thought. Marcus tried to keep calm. He had been told countless times to remain silent and wait for things to play out, especially in situations like this. But it was getting harder. He could feel the unfairness of it all weighing on him. He knew the officer had planted the evidence, but how could he prove it? Then the officer returned to the car, his face hard as he opened the back door. Without a word, he pulled Marcus out, handcuffing him loosely. "You're coming with me," the officer said in a flat tone. "Why? What's going to happen now?" Marcus asked, struggling to control his voice. The officer didn't answer at first. Instead, he led Marcus to his patrol car, pushing him into the back seat. As the door slammed shut, Marcus felt a wave of frustration, but also a sense of disbelief. He had been wronged, and now he had to face the consequences of something he hadn't done. The officer was determined to make this look like a clear-cut case of possession. Inside the patrol car, Marcus's mind raced. The officer had found the bag of illegal substances Marcus knew he hadn't put there. He wanted to scream, to shout out the truth, but the more he thought about it, the more he realized that his words might not even matter right now. If the officer was determined to accuse him, how could he convince anyone of the truth? They drove for what felt like an eternity, the hum of the car's engine only adding to Marcus's growing anxiety. The officer didn't speak during the ride, and Marcus didn't try to say anything more. He just sat there, focused on the sound of the engine and trying to steady his breathing. When they finally arrived at the station, the officer led him inside, still silent. Marcus felt like a prisoner, walking through the halls of the building, surrounded by people who might not care about his innocence. His mind kept returning to the phone in his pocket. The secret recording was still running, capturing everything. The officer's actions, his words, the entire interaction. It was all there, but would anyone listen? Would anyone believe him if he showed them? Inside, they placed Marcus in a small holding room. The officer disappeared for a moment, leaving him alone. Marcus took a deep breath and reached into his pocket. His fingers brushed against his phone, still quietly recording. He quickly unlocked it, making sure no one could see him, and began reviewing the video. It was all there: the officer planting the drugs, the false accusations, the moments that could prove his innocence. But as he watched, a thought crept into his mind. What if the officer tried to destroy the recording? What if no one believed him, even with the evidence in hand? Marcus's heart sank. He knew he had to be careful. The last thing he wanted was to lose the chance to prove what had happened. As he sat there, waiting for the next part of the process to unfold, Marcus made a vow to himself. No matter what it took, he would make sure the truth came out. The recording was his lifeline. He wouldn't let it slip away. The battle for justice was just beginning. As Marcus sat in the holding room, the minutes dragged on, each one feeling longer than the last. He could hear the murmur of voices from outside the small cold room, but inside, it felt like time had slowed to a crawl. His thoughts kept circling back to the recording on his phone. It was the only thing that could prove he was telling the truth, but it felt like such a fragile hope. What if the officers found the phone? What if someone deleted the recording? He couldn't afford to take any chances. The phone was still in his pocket, quietly recording. Marcus had made sure the screen was locked so no one would notice it, but his mind couldn't stop racing. The evidence he needed to expose the officer's actions was right there, but it was also vulnerable. He had to protect it, and he had to figure out how to use it. It was quiet in the room, and for a moment, Marcus allowed himself to relax just enough to think clearly. He knew the officer had planted the drugs in his car. He had seen it happen. But how could he make someone believe him? The police officer had authority, and Marcus was just one person. He didn't have the power to prove anything on his own. But the phone, his phone, could change that. If he could get the right person to listen, everything would be different. His mind jumped to the idea of federal investigators. They were the only ones who would have the resources and the power to act on the truth. But how would he reach them? How would he make sure the recording didn't just disappear into the system, with no one ever noticing it? As if on cue, the door to the room opened. Marcus tensed, straightening up, ready for whatever came next. A uniformed officer stepped inside, followed by another man in plain clothes. The man in plain clothes had a calm, professional look about him, but there was something in his eyes that made Marcus sit up straighter. He couldn't put his finger on it, but he knew this wasn't just another officer. This was someone who wasn't part of the usual routine. "Marcus, right?" the man in plain clothes said, his voice calm and steady. "I'm Detective Hayes. We're just getting some details about what happened today. I know this is a difficult situation, but I'd like to ask you a few questions." Marcus looked at him closely. Something about Hayes felt different. He wasn't there to intimidate. He wasn't there to accuse. It was as if he was looking for something deeper, something hidden. "I didn't do anything wrong," Marcus said, his voice firm but controlled. "I was pulled over, and the officer planted drugs in my car." Detective Hayes raised an eyebrow, but didn't interrupt. Instead, he pulled up a chair and sat across from Marcus. "I understand, but we need to make sure we get the facts straight. Is there anything you can show us?" Marcus's heart skipped a beat. Was this it? Was this the chance he had been waiting for? He hesitated for a moment, then made up his mind. Reaching into his pocket, he pulled out the phone and handed it to Hayes. "There's a recording. It shows everything. What happened during the stop?" Detective Hayes looked at the phone in his hand, then back at Marcus. "You were recording the whole thing?" "Yes," Marcus replied. "I always do. I'm careful, especially with the police." The detective didn't seem surprised, but he nodded. "Good. Let's take a look." Marcus watched closely as Detective Hayes unlocked the phone and started playing the recording. The sound of the officer's voice, along with the image of him planting the drugs in Marcus's car, filled the room. Hayes didn't say anything at first, but his eyes flickered over the screen as he watched the officer's actions in disbelief. When the video ended, there was a long silence. Marcus held his breath, waiting for the detective's reaction. Finally, Hayes spoke. "This is something else. You did the right thing by recording this. We'll take it from here." Marcus felt a wave of relief wash over him, but he didn't let himself get too hopeful just yet. The detective hadn't made any promises. There was still a long road ahead, but one thing was clear. For the first time, someone believed him. The truth was out there, and now it was in the hands of someone who could do something about it. Marcus sat in the small room, feeling a mix of relief and anxiety. Detective Hayes had taken the recording, and for the first time since this whole ordeal started, Marcus felt like someone truly believed him. The weight of the situation still lingered in his mind, but there was a glimmer of hope. He could only hope that the detective would take the evidence seriously and do something about it. The minutes seemed to stretch into hours as Marcus waited, the silence in the room heavy and tense. His mind kept returning to the officer who had stopped him. The same officer who had planted the drugs. Marcus felt a deep sense of anger building inside him. The officer had tried to set him up, and now it seemed like he had finally made a mistake, one that could cost him everything. After what seemed like an eternity, the door to the room opened. Marcus looked up, expecting to see Detective Hayes again, but it wasn't him. Instead, the officer who had stopped him earlier walked into the room, his face grim and his eyes hard. Marcus's heart sank. He had hoped that this day would bring justice, but now it seemed like the officer was here to make sure that wouldn't happen. He didn't know how the officer had found out, but it didn't matter. The situation had just taken a turn for the worse. "Marcus," the officer said, his voice cold and dismissive, "I see you've been talking to someone, but I'm afraid you don't fully understand what's going on here." Marcus stood up, his pulse quickening. "What are you talking about?" The officer's face tightened. "I know about the recording, but you can't just go around making false accusations against officers. You're going to regret this." Marcus felt a chill run down his spine. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. The officer was threatening him, trying to intimidate him into backing down. It was as if he thought the power he had would shield him from the consequences of his actions. Marcus had to stay calm. He couldn't let the officer get to him. "I haven't done anything wrong," Marcus said, trying to keep his voice steady. "You're the one who planted the drugs. The truth is on my phone." The officer smirked, clearly unfazed by Marcus's words. "Do you really think anyone is going to believe you over me? I've been doing this job for years. I know how to cover my tracks." Marcus felt his stomach churn. This officer was not only corrupt, but also confident that he could get away with his actions. It was a dangerous combination, but Marcus wasn't going to back down. He had to fight, even if it meant going up against a powerful officer who thought he was above the law. Before Marcus could respond, the door opened again, and Detective Hayes stepped inside. He glanced at the officer with a look that was both calm and firm. "I think you've said enough," Hayes said, his voice quiet but full of authority. "Marcus, you're free to go. We'll be taking it from here." The officer's face twisted with anger. "You don't know what you're dealing with," he spat. "You're making a big mistake." But Hayes didn't flinch. He turned to Marcus. "Come on, let's get you out of here." As they walked out of the room together, Marcus couldn't help but feel a sense of triumph. The officer had tried to intimidate him, to scare him into silence, but it hadn't worked. He had stayed calm, and now the truth was starting to come to light. It wasn't over yet. Marcus knew that the road ahead would be difficult, and there would likely be more challenges along the way. But for the first time in a long while, he felt like justice was within reach. The officer had underestimated him, and that was a mistake he was about to regret. The next few days were a blur for Marcus, After his release, he spent hours replaying the events over and over in his mind. He couldn't quite believe everything that had happened, but one thing was clear. He had done the right thing by recording the entire interaction with the officer. That video was his proof. And now it was in the hands of Detective Hayes, someone who appeared to care about justice. The first few days after the recording were filled with uncertainty. Marcus wasn't sure what would happen next. He had given the detective the key evidence, but he knew that the officer involved would try to cover his tracks. What if the department backed him up? What if everything was dismissed and Marcus's word wasn't enough? But he didn't have to wait long before he received a call that changed everything. "Marcus, this is Detective Hayes." The voice on the phone said, "I need you to come down to the station. We've started investigating the officer." Marcus felt a surge of hope as he heard those words. The detective was moving forward with the case, and things were starting to take shape. It wasn't just about him anymore. It was about uncovering the truth, about bringing justice to light for anyone who had been wronged. When Marcus arrived at the station, Hayes was waiting for him. The detective led him into a small room where they could speak privately. There was a serious look in Hayes's eyes, but it wasn't the same coldness Marcus had seen from the officer. "We've reviewed your recording carefully," Hayes began, his voice steady. "And it's clear that the officer planted the drugs in your car. But we need more. We need to build a case against him, and we need to be sure that we have all the evidence we can gather." Marcus nodded, his heart pounding. He knew this wasn't going to be easy. It wasn't just about one officer. It was about a pattern, a history of corruption that could go deep within the department. But Marcus was determined. He had already taken the first step, and he wasn't about to back down now. "The officer in question, Officer Johnson, has a record. We found complaints against him from other drivers," Hayes continued. "Some of them reported similar incidents, but no one ever had enough proof to take action. Your recording gives us what we need." Marcus sat forward, his mind racing. He had no idea that there were other people who had experienced the same thing. That made this situation even bigger than he had realized. The officer wasn't just targeting him. He was hurting others too. "This isn't just about you, Marcus," Hayes said. "We've already started reaching out to the others. We want to hear their stories, and we'll bring them all together. This is going to take time, but we're on the right track." Marcus took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of everything, but there was also a sense of relief. The detective had a plan. It wasn't going to be an easy fight, but it was one that Marcus knew was worth fighting. He had to see it through. "I'm with you," Marcus said firmly. "I'll do whatever I can to help." Over the next few weeks, the investigation gathered momentum. The team began to piece together a growing list of allegations against Officer Johnson. More people came forward with their stories, and one by one, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit. It wasn't just about one bad officer. It was about exposing a deep level of corruption within the department. Marcus's role in all of this was crucial. His courage, his willingness to stand up for what was right, and his careful recording of the officer's actions were the foundation that the investigation was built on. Slowly but surely, the truth was starting to unfold, and Marcus felt proud to be part of something much bigger than himself. The journey wasn't over yet, but Marcus could see the light at the end of the tunnel. The fight for justice had only just begun, and he was ready to see it through, no matter what. The days following Marcus's meeting with Detective Hayes felt like a whirlwind. With each passing day, more and more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. The investigation into Officer Johnson's actions was no longer just a case of one officer's wrongdoing. It was a much bigger issue. Marcus had unwittingly uncovered a pattern of corruption that had been brewing for years, and now, with the evidence he had provided, the whole department would have to face the truth. The detectives' team worked tirelessly, reaching out to others who had experienced similar treatment. Slowly but surely, people began to come forward, sharing their own stories of being wronged by Officer Johnson. Some were afraid to speak out, but after seeing the video that Marcus had captured, they found the courage to tell the truth. Each new testimony added weight to the case, building a foundation that was strong enough to take down someone who had long operated with impunity. Marcus spent most of his days at home, trying to stay out of the way as the investigation unfolded. He felt anxious, yet hopeful, knowing that the case was moving forward. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was determined to see it through. His life had been turned upside down, but he wasn't going to let the officer's actions go unpunished. He had seen the power of standing up for what's right, and now he was part of something bigger than he had ever imagined. One afternoon, Marcus got a call from Detective Hayes. His voice was steady, but there was a hint of excitement in it. "Marcus, we've gathered enough evidence," Hayes said. "It's time. We're filing formal charges against Officer Johnson." Marcus felt a rush of relief and excitement. It was happening. The man who had tried to ruin his life was about to be held accountable. It wasn't over yet, but this was a major step forward. The news spread quickly, and soon the department was in full crisis mode. The public was outraged when the charges were made public, and the media picked up on the story. People who had been silent for years now found themselves speaking out, demanding justice for those who had been hurt by corrupt officers. It was clear that this was no longer just about Marcus. It was a fight for fairness, for truth, and for accountability. The days following the announcement were filled with interviews, meetings, and preparations for the trial. Marcus's role was crucial. His video had been the spark that had started it all. But as the case gathered more attention, he couldn't help but feel overwhelmed. He was a regular guy, and now he was at the center of a legal battle that could change things for so many others. He tried to keep his head down, but he knew he couldn't back up now. The trial was set, and Marcus was called to testify. Standing in the courtroom, he felt a mix of nerves and determination. He had to tell this story, and he had to do it for all the other people who had been hurt by Officer Johnson's actions. His heart pounded in his chest as he stepped up to the witness stand, the eyes of the room on him. He could feel the weight of the moment, but he stood tall. He knew this was his chance to make a difference. As Marcus spoke, recounting the events of that day, he realized how far he had come. What had started as a simple traffic stop had turned into something much larger. It was no longer just about him. It was about the truth coming to light, about standing up against injustice, and about showing others that their voices mattered. The trial would take time, but for the first time in a long while, Marcus felt hopeful. He had done what he could to make a difference, and now it was up to the courts to decide. He knew that no matter the outcome, he had already won. The truth had been uncovered, and that was something no one could take away from him. The trial was underway, and Marcus found himself sitting in the courtroom, waiting for the next phase of the case to unfold. It had been weeks since the charges were filed against Officer Johnson, and the anticipation in the air was thick. The courtroom was filled with people, including members of the media, eager to witness the outcome of the trial that had captured everyone's attention. What started as a single injustice was now a moment in history for the community, and Marcus was at the heart of it. Marcus's thoughts were a whirlwind as he sat in the witness stand. He had spent hours preparing himself for this moment, trying to calm his nerves. He had never imagined that his simple decision to record a traffic stop would lead to something this big. But now, everything was at stake. Not just for him, but for everyone who had been mistreated by Officer Johnson, or anyone like him. This was bigger than a single case. It was about making sure that truth and justice would always prevail. His heart pounded as he looked around the courtroom. His lawyer gave him an encouraging smile, but Marcus still felt a sense of pressure. He was the one with the truth, but could it be enough? Would the jury believe him? Would they see the officer for what he truly was? It was time. The judge called for silence, and the courtroom fell still. Marcus stood and approached the stand, the eyes of everyone in the room on him. As he took the oath and sat down to testify, his mind flashed back to that moment when the officer had pulled him over. It felt like so much had changed since that day. He was no longer just the quiet driver trying to make it home. He was now a key player in a fight for justice. One by one, The lawyers asked their questions. Marcus stayed calm, answering each one clearly. He explained how the officer had pulled him over for no reason, how the officer had acted suspiciously, and how the officer had planted the drugs in his car. He also talked about the secret recording on his phone, how it captured everything, including the officer's actions and words. The video was shown to the jury, and the room fell silent as they watched the events unfold on the screen. It was clear to everyone in the room what had happened. The officer had lied, and the evidence Marcus had provided was undeniable. As the video ended, Marcus could see the expressions of disbelief on the jury's faces. They were starting to understand the full scope of the injustice that had taken place. As the trial continued, more witnesses came forward. People who had been mistreated by Officer Johnson and others who had been afraid to speak out now found the courage to tell their stories. With each new voice, the case against the officer grew stronger. It wasn't just about Marcus anymore. It was about a whole community coming together to demand accountability. Finally, after days of testimony, the jury retired to deliberate. Marcus sat anxiously in his seat, waiting for the decision that would change everything. He had done everything he could to make sure the truth was heard. And now, it was out of his hands. He looked at Detective Hayes, who gave him a reassuring nod. The minutes felt like hours as the jury deliberated. When the doors to the jury room opened, the silence in the courtroom was deafening. The foreman stood, holding the verdict in his hand. "We, the jury, find the defendant guilty as charged," the foreman said, and the words hit Marcus like a wave of relief. Tears filled Marcus's eyes as the room erupted in applause. Officer Johnson was guilty, and justice had been served. Marcus had stood up for what was right, and the truth had prevailed. It wasn't just his victory. It was a victory for everyone who had been wronged, for every person who had ever felt powerless in the face of corruption. As Marcus left the courtroom, he felt a weight lift from his shoulders. He had helped change the system. He had made a difference. And though the battle was over, the lessons he had learned would stay with him forever. Justice was not always easy, but it was always worth fighting for.